The morning of June 17th, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Corporal James Henderson of the 4th Marine Division crouched behind a coral outcropping as the pre-dawn darkness gave way to grey light. Around him, the sounds of diesel engines rumbled through the humid air, growing louder with each passing second. Japanese tanks were coming. Henderson had been on Saipan for exactly 24 hours. Yesterday's landing had been bloody but manageable. The Marines had pushed inland from the beaches, establishing a perimeter that now stretched nearly a mile from the waterline. But intelligence reports warned that the Japanese would counterattack, and when they came, they would bring armor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 0300 hours, the attack began. Through the morning mist, Henderson watched as dark shapes emerged from the volcanic ridgeline to the north. Type 95 Hargo light tanks, supported by the larger Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, advanced toward the Marine positions in what would become the largest armored engagement of the Pacific War. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment was throwing everything it had at the American beachhead, 44 tanks total, supported by hundreds of infantry, all gambling on one desperate thrust to drive the Marines back into the sea. Henderson's company had only one answer: 4 M3 Stuart light tanks from the Marine Tank Battalion, positioned hull down behind earthworks, waiting for the Japanese armor to close the distance. The Marines had been told their Stuarts were obsolete, inadequate, barely better than the enemy tanks they would face. One tanker had joked grimly the night before that it would be like two blind men fighting with switchblades in a closet, both sides armed with 37mm pop guns that could barely scratch each other's paint. But as the first rays of sunlight broke over the Pacific and illuminated the advancing Japanese armor, Henderson saw something that would be repeated in 100 after-action reports from a dozen Pacific islands. The Marines weren't laughing anymore. They were recognizing a brutal mathematical truth that would define armored warfare in the Pacific theater. The Type 95 wasn't just inadequate. It was catastrophically outmatched, a relic from a different era of warfare. Forced to fight in a conflict it had no hope of surviving. The Japanese tankers driving toward Henderson's position that morning believed they were operating cutting-edge equipment. The Type 95 Hargo had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army when it entered service in 1935. Designed to solve the mobility problems of its predecessor, the slow Type 89, the Hargo, represented Japan's attempt to create a modern, fast infantry support tank that could keep pace with mechanized operations. On paper, the specifications seemed reasonable for a light tank of the mid-1930s. The Hargo weighed just over 8 tons, fully loaded. A Mitsubishi 6-cylinder diesel engine producing 120 horsepower pushed the tank to a maximum road speed of 28 miles per hour, exceptionally fast for the era. The suspension used distinctive bell-crank bogies designed by Tomio Hara, which gave the tank adequate cross-country mobility. The three-man crew consisted of a commander who also served as gunner for the main weapon, a hull machine gunner, and a driver. Armament appeared adequate for the tank's intended role. The Type 94 37mm main gun, mounted in a fully rotating turret, could fire armor-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,300 feet per second. At 500 meters, the gun could theoretically penetrate 25 millimeters of vertical armor plate, sufficient to defeat the light tanks operated by Chinese forces in the late 1930s. Two Type 97 7.7mm machine guns provided additional firepower, one mounted in the hull and another in the rear of the turret. Protection, however, told a different story. Maximum armor thickness on the Type 95 reached just 12 millimeters on the hull and turret faces. The sides measured 12 millimeters. The rear measured 12 millimeters. The top and bottom measured 6 millimeters. To put this in perspective, 12 millimeters equals roughly half an inch. A skilled rifleman with armor-piercing ammunition and a good angle could penetrate the tank's armor. A heavy machine gun firing from close range could tear through the thin plates. The Type 95 wasn't armored. It was wrapped in sheet metal. But in 1935, when the tank entered service, this seemed acceptable. The Imperial Japanese Army had designed the Hargo to fight in China, where enemy, armor consisted primarily of outdated European light tanks and tankettes. Against these opponents, the Type 95 performed admirably. Its speed allowed it to outmaneuver heavier enemy vehicles. Its 37mm gun could defeat the thin armor of Chinese tanks. Its diesel engine provided excellent range and reduced fire risk compared to gasoline-powered vehicles. Most importantly, it could be produced in reasonable numbers by Japanese industry and transported efficiently across the vast distances of the Asian mainland. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937, validated these design choices. Type 95 tanks spearheaded Japanese advances through China, operating in environments where enemy anti-tank weapons were scarce and opposing armor was minimal. The tanks proved reliable, mobile, and effective in their primary mission of infantry support. Japanese tank crews developed confidence in their vehicles, believing they operated equipment that matched or exceeded anything their enemies could field. This confidence persisted through 1939, when Type 95 tanks participated in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol against Soviet forces in Mongolia. Here, the limitations began to show. Soviet BT tanks mounted 45mm guns that outranged and outpenetrated the Hargo's 37mm weapon. Soviet armor proved resistant to Japanese anti-tank rounds, but the battle remained limited in scope, and Japanese planners chose to interpret the results optimistically. The Type 95, they concluded, remained adequate for the conflicts Japan anticipated fighting. Then came December 1941, and everything changed. When Japanese forces launched their offensive across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Type 95 tanks participated in the invasion of Malaya, the Philippines, and numerous island operations. Initial results seemed to validate the tank's design. In Malaya, Hargo tanks surprised British defenders by operating effectively in dense jungle terrain that British planners had believed impassable to armor. The tank's lightweight and narrow profile allowed them to traverse trails and roads that heavier vehicles could not negotiate. Japanese armor played a crucial role in the rapid conquest of Malaya and the fall of Singapore. In the Philippines, Type 95 tanks of the 4th Tank Regiment achieved the distinction of fighting America's first tank versus tank engagement of World War II. On December 22, 1941, north of Mortis, during the American retreat toward Bataan, a platoon of 5 brand-new M3 Stuart light tanks from B Company, 192nd Tank Battalion, encountered Japanese armor. Both the Type 95 and the M3 Stuart mounted 37mm guns. Both were light tanks designed primarily for infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat, but the Stuart possessed substantially thicker armor, 32mm on the turret sides compared to the Hargo's 12mm. The engagement proved brief and decisive. Japanese tankers, possessing better tactical position and achieving surprise, knocked out the lead American Stuart and damaged the other 4 tanks, forcing them to withdraw. The Japanese captured the burned-out American tank and its crew, including Lieutenant Ben Morin. From the Japanese perspective, the battle confirmed that their tactics and training could overcome American material advantages. The Type 95 had met the American light tank in combat and won. But what Japanese commanders failed to grasp was that the Battle of Mortis represented an outlier, a tactical victory achieved through superior positioning and surprise rather than superior equipment. The American tanks had been caught in disadvantageous terrain, with inexperienced crews operating brand-new vehicles they hadn't fully mastered. Remove those tactical factors, and the underlying material reality became stark. The M3 Stuart was simply the better tank. The Stuart possessed frontal armor ranging from 38 to 51mm thick, 3 to 4 times thicker than the Hargo. The upper front hull measured 38mm, the lower front glacis measured 44mm, the gun mantlet measured 51mm, turret sides measured 38mm. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. While hull sides and rear measured 25mm. Even the thinnest armor on the Stuart exceeded the maximum armor on the Type 95. This armor disparity translated directly into survivability. A Type 95's 37mm gun could penetrate the Stuart side armor at close range, but struggled against the frontal arc. The Stuart's 37mm M5 gun, firing the same caliber ammunition but with superior American propellant and manufacturing quality, could penetrate the Hargo from any angle at any practical combat range. Every encounter between these two tanks would favor the Stuart, assuming equal crew skill and tactical positioning, but the Stuart represented only the beginning of American armored capability in the Pacific. By mid-1942, the Marine Corps began receiving M4 Sherman medium tanks. The Sherman mounted a 75mm gun that could destroy a Type 95 from over a mile away. Its frontal armor measured 64mm thick, making it effectively immune to the Hargo's puny 37mm gun. The Sherman weighed 30 tons, nearly 4 times the weight of the Japanese light tank. It was faster, more reliable, better protected, and infinitely more lethal. Japanese tank crews who encountered Shermans described the experience in terms of absolute helplessness. Their armor-piercing rounds would strike the American tank and ricochet harmlessly off the thick frontal plate, leaving nothing but a shallow dent. Meanwhile, a single 75mm high-explosive round from the Sherman would tear a Type 95 apart, the thin armor offering no more resistance than cardboard. Crews died before they even realized they were under fire. The mathematics of industrial production compounded this tactical disparity. Between 1936 and 1943, Japanese factories produced approximately 2,300 Type 95 tanks. This represented the most numerous armored vehicle produced by Japan during the entire war. American industry, by contrast, produced over 13,000 M3 Stuart light tanks between 1941 and 1943. They produced nearly 50,000 M4 Sherman medium tanks between 1942 and 1945. For every Type 95 that rolled off Japanese assembly lines, American factories produced 20 or more tanks, each one individually superior in armor, firepower, and reliability. This industrial disparity reflected fundamental differences in national capacity and strategic priorities. American factories operated with abundant raw materials, unlimited electrical power, and a workforce that faced no threat of enemy bombardment. Japanese industry struggled with severe resource constraints, frequent Allied bombing raids, and a prioritization system that funneled the best steel and most skilled workers to naval shipbuilding rather than tank production. By 1944, Japanese industry could barely produce tanks at all, while American production continued to accelerate. The doctrine governing tank employment reflected these industrial realities. American armored doctrine in the Pacific emphasized tanks as infantry support weapons, working in close coordination with rifle companies to reduce enemy fortifications and provide mobile firepower. Marine and Army tank units developed sophisticated combined arms tactics, with tanks advancing under covering fire from infantry, while infantry moved forward under protection from tank guns. Radio communication allowed real-time coordination between tank commanders and infantry officers. Replacement tanks arrived regularly from rear area depots. Damaged tanks could be repaired or replaced within days. Japanese armored doctrine, by contrast, became increasingly desperate as the war progressed. With no hope of replacing losses, Japanese commanders husbanded their precious tanks in rear areas, reluctant to commit them to combat where they would inevitably be destroyed. When tanks did enter battle, they often did so in suicidal charges designed to achieve maximum shock effect before inevitable annihilation. Tank crews understood they would not survive these attacks. The tanks became, in effect, armored kamikazes, one-way weapons expended for temporary tactical advantage. This transformation became evident at Guadalcanal in August 1942, the first major American counteroffensive in the Pacific. The Marine Corps 1st Tank Battalion landed with M2 A4 light tanks, the immediate predecessor to the M3 Stuart. These tanks mounted the same 37mm gun and similar armor protection. Against the Type 95 tanks operated by Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, the American tanks proved decisively superior. But more important than the tanks themselves was the doctrine governing their use. Marine tankers worked closely with infantry, developing tactics specifically for the unique challenges of jungle warfare. Tanks would advance slowly through dense vegetation, with infantry clearing the immediate surroundings to prevent Japanese soldiers from attacking with magnetic mines or satchel charges. When tanks encountered bunkers or fortified positions, they would halt and methodically reduce them with 37mm canister rounds that turned each tank into a gigantic shotgun, spraying hundreds of steel balls that shredded anything in the open. Infantry would then move forward to secure the position while tanks provided covering fire. The Japanese, meanwhile, employed their tanks in desperate banzai charges that emphasized shock and speed over tactical coordination. Type 95 tanks would burst from concealment and race toward American positions, hoping to overrun machine gun nests and artillery batteries before being destroyed. These attacks sometimes achieved temporary success through sheer audacity, but they invariably resulted in the complete destruction of the attacking tank force. At the Battle of Tenaru on August 27, 1942, Marine tanks advancing into a Japanese-held coconut grove literally crushed enemy soldiers hiding in the underbrush, knocking over palm trees and grinding through prepared positions with mechanical indifference. Tarawa, in November 1943, revealed the full extent of Japanese armored inadequacy. 7 Type 95 tanks defended Betio Island, some positioned in prepared emplacements as mobile pillboxes, others held in reserve for counterattacks. The Marine Corps 2nd Tank Battalion brought 8 M4 Sherman medium tanks to the battle, the first combat deployment of Shermans by Marine tankers. The contrast was immediate and devastating. During the chaotic landings, one Hago managed to surprise an advancing Sherman named China Gal. The Japanese tank fired its 37mm gun, and in an extraordinary display of either skill or luck, the armor-piercing round travelled directly down the barrel of the Sherman's 75mm gun, jamming the turret and disabling the main weapon. This represented the single most successful engagement by a Japanese light tank against a Sherman in the entire Pacific War. It lasted approximately 5 seconds. The Sherman's commander, Lieutenant Edward Bale, immediately responded with machine gun fire that suppressed the Japanese tank, then either rammed it or destroyed it with additional fire, depending on which after-action report one believes. Either way, the Type 95 was eliminated, and China Gal continued fighting as an armoured machine gun platform for the remainder of the battle. The other 6 Type 95 tanks at Tarawa fared no better. Marines destroyed them systematically, either with tank fire, bazookas, or demolition charges. None survived the battle. Not a single Marine Sherman was lost to enemy armour. The disparity wasn't close, it was absolute. This pattern repeated across every subsequent Pacific battle. At Eniwetok in February 1944, 3 Type 95 tanks were destroyed on Parry Island during brief engagements with Marine Shermans. The Japanese tanks never even managed to damage an American vehicle before being annihilated. At Saipan in June 1944, the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment launched the attack that Corporal Henderson witnessed, 44 tanks in a coordinated assault against the Marine beachhead. American after-action reports documented the complete destruction of this force in less than 2 hours. Only 12 Japanese tanks escaped the killing field, and those only because they broke off the attack early and retreated into the interior of the island where they were hunted down and destroyed over the following days. The technical specifications told part of the story, the tactical applications told another. But the human element completed the picture. Japanese tank crews went into battle, knowing they faced overwhelming odds. American tankers went into battle confident that their vehicles were superior to anything the enemy could field. This psychological advantage proved as important as any technical specification. Marine tank commanders described encountering Type 95 tanks with a mixture of professional respect for the courage of Japanese crews and stark recognition of the material disparity. One Sherman commander at Guam in July 1944 watched a Japanese light tank approach his position and radioed to his gunner, asking if he should even bother with an armor-piercing round or just use high explosive. The gunner suggested high explosive to ensure complete destruction. The Sherman fired once. The Type 95 disappeared in a fireball, its thin armor providing no protection whatsoever against the massive 75mm shell. At Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese defenders had learned from previous defeats. They employed their tanks primarily as static fortifications, dug into prepared positions where they could provide supporting fire without maneuvering across open ground. This tactic extended the tank's survival by hours rather than minutes, but the end result remained identical. American tanks and infantry systematically reduced each position, destroying the immobile Type 95s with concentrated fire or close assault with demolition charges. The final large-scale employment of Japanese armor came at Okinawa in April 1945. The 27th Tank Regiment, the last significant Japanese tank formation in the Pacific, possessed 13 Type 95 Hago light tanks and 14 Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha medium tanks. Against this force, American commanders deployed more than 800 tanks, including hundreds of M4 Shermans from Army tank battalions and Marine tank battalions. The numerical disparity was 30-1. The qualitative disparity was even greater. On May 5, 1945, the Japanese regiment launched a desperate counterattack, attempting to disrupt American offensive operations through sheer audacity. Within hours, the attack collapsed. American tanks and anti-tank weapons destroyed most of the Japanese armor before it even reached American positions. The survivors retreated in disorder, their combat effectiveness shattered. The 27th Tank Regiment ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Throughout these engagements, one question persisted among military historians who later analyzed the Pacific armored battles. Why did Japan continue producing and deploying the Type 95 when its inadequacy was obvious by 1943 at the latest? Why not halt production and concentrate resources on more effective designs? The answer revealed the fundamental constraints that crippled Japanese military effectiveness. Japan possessed several improved tank designs in development throughout the war. The Type 4 Chi-To medium tank mounted a more powerful 75mm gun and thicker armor. The Type 5 Chi-Ri was even more capable. But these designs never entered mass production because Japan simply lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers, while simultaneously building aircraft, warships, and the other implements of modern warfare. Japanese steel production in 1944 totaled approximately 7 million metric tons. American steel production in the same year exceeded 89 million metric tons, more than 12 times Japan's output. This disparity extended to every industrial metric: electrical power generation, machine tool production, skilled labor availability. The Japanese economy was fighting a war it could never win through attrition, and armor production merely highlighted this reality. The Type 95 continued in production not because Japanese planners believed it was adequate, but because it was all they could produce. The manufacturing facilities existed, the workforce knew how to build them, the supply chains were established. Shifting production to a new design would have required months of retooling, during which tank production would halt completely. So Japanese factories continued stamping out Type 95 tanks, using increasingly inferior materials and increasingly desperate manufacturing shortcuts. By 1945, Type 95 tanks rolling off assembly lines barely resembled the original 1935 design. Chrome lining disappeared from gun barrels, armor plates showed rough welding and poor finish. Mechanical components wore out rapidly due to substandard metallurgy. These late-war tanks broke down frequently, suffered mechanical failures, and provided even less protection than their predecessors. But they were tanks, and Japan needed any tanks it could field, regardless of quality. Captured Japanese technical manuals revealed the disconnect between doctrine and reality. Training documents instructed crews to engage enemy tanks at ranges up to 400 meters, completely unrealistic given the Type 95's effective range against American armor. Manuals emphasized accuracy over rate of fire, contradicting the fundamental purpose of an automatic weapon. They recommended single shots to conserve ammunition, negating any advantage the tank's gun might provide. These contradictions demonstrated that Japanese military leadership had lost touch with battlefield realities. Combat experience reports from Japanese survivors painted a grimmer picture. Tank crews described watching their armor-piercing rounds bounce harmlessly off Sherman frontal armor while American high-explosive shells tore their vehicles apart. They described the terror of knowing their armor provided no protection against anything larger than a rifle bullet. They described mechanical breakdowns that left them stranded within sight of safety. Above all, they described the hopelessness of fighting with equipment they knew was obsolete, inadequate, and ineffective. One Japanese tank commander captured at Okinawa told his American interrogators that his crew had nicknamed their Type 95 the coffin on tracks. They knew that entering combat meant certain death. They went anyway, because Japanese military culture demanded it. But they harbored no illusions about their chances of survival or their ability to meaningfully affect the battle's outcome. American intelligence officers who examined captured Type 95 tanks filed reports that mixed professional analysis with barely concealed contempt. An ordnance evaluation at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland tested a Hargo recovered from the Pacific and concluded that it represented technology a decade behind American standards. The thin armor could be penetrated by 50 caliber machine gun fire from close range. The 37mm gun lacked the power to defeat American light tank armor, let alone the Sherman's thick plates. The suspension was crude. The engine was underpowered. The vision devices were inadequate. The overall assessment, a light tank that would have been marginally acceptable in 1935, but was completely obsolete by 1943. Marine Corps training manuals incorporated lessons from Pacific tank battles into doctrine that would influence American armored warfare for decades. Tank infantry cooperation became fundamental to Marine tactical philosophy. The importance of overwhelming material superiority was emphasized. The value of reliable, maintainable vehicles was stressed, and the lesson that courage and determination, while admirable, could not overcome fundamental technological and industrial disadvantage, was driven home repeatedly. For the Marines who fought at Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, and Okinawa, the Type 95 became almost a tragic figure. They respected the bravery of Japanese tank crews who would charge American positions knowing they faced certain death. They respected the mechanical ingenuity of Japanese engineers who had designed a tank that worked adequately for its original purpose. But they also recognized that the Type 95 represented everything wrong with Japan's approach to the Pacific War, a war that Japan entered with inadequate industrial capacity, obsolete equipment, and no realistic path to victory. The morning of June 17, 1944, when Corporal Henderson watched Japanese tanks advance toward his position, he was witnessing the culmination of decisions made years earlier in Tokyo and Washington. Japan had chosen to build light tanks suitable for colonial warfare in China. America had chosen to build medium tanks capable of fighting Germany's panzers. When these two philosophies collided in the Pacific, the outcome was never in doubt. By the time the sun rose fully over Saipan that morning, the Japanese armored attack had been shattered. 44 tanks had advanced into the Marine positions, perhaps a dozen retreated. The rest burned where they stopped, thin armor torn open by American fire, crews dead at their stations. The largest tank battle in Pacific history lasted less time than an infantry platoon needed to clear a single fortified position. Henderson survived the battle and the war. He returned to the United States in late 1945 and spent the rest of his life trying to explain what it felt like to watch men die in vehicles that should never have been sent into combat. He never found adequate words. The mathematics spoke for themselves. 12 millimeters of armor against 75 millimeter guns, 8 tons against 30 tons, 2,300 produced against 50,000. These numbers told the story better than any narrative could. Type 95 versus M3 Stuart script, Part 2. The technical specifications become more meaningful when examined through the lens of actual combat encounters. The numbers on a datasheet tell one story. The experience of men who fought in and against these machines tells another. Together, they reveal why the Type 95 Hargo became synonymous with obsolescence in the Pacific theater. Consider the basic physics of armor penetration. When a 37mm armor-piercing round strikes a steel plate, the outcome depends on several factors: the velocity of the projectile, the angle of impact, the hardness of both the projectile and the target armor, and the thickness of the plate. The Type 95's gun could penetrate 25mm of vertical armor at 500 meters under ideal conditions, but ideal conditions never existed in combat. The M3 Stuart's frontal armor measured 38 to 51mm thick, well beyond the Hargo's penetration capability, except at point-blank range against the thinnest sections. More critically, American armor used face-hardened steel that increased effective thickness by 15 to 20%. The welded construction of later Stuart variants eliminated weak points that existed in riveted armor, and the sloped glacis plates on American tanks increased effective thickness further through angle of impact calculations. A Type 95 crew facing a Stuart head-on would need to close to within 50 meters and aim for the lower hull sides to have any realistic chance of penetration. But closing to 50 meters meant exposing their own vehicle to devastating return fire. The Stuart's 37mm gun could penetrate the Hargo's 12mm armor from 1,000 meters. The Japanese tank existed in a kill zone that extended 10 times farther than its own effective range. Against the M4 Sherman, the disparity became absurd. The Sherman's 75mm gun fired high-explosive shells weighing over 14 pounds. When such a shell struck a Type 95, the thin armor provided no protection whatsoever. The explosive force would tear the hull apart, the overpressure would kill the crew instantly, and the fuel and ammunition would ignite in a secondary explosion that left nothing but a burned-out shell. Sherman crews reported that Type 95s literally disintegrated when hit by 75mm fire. One moment a tank existed, the next moment only smoking fragments remained. Japanese tank crews understood this disparity intimately. Surviving tankers described the psychological horror of knowing their armor was meaningless. Private Takeshi Maeda, a Hargo driver captured on Tinian, told American interrogators about his first encounter with a Sherman. His platoon of 3 Type 95s had been ordered to ambush American tanks advancing along a jungle trail. They positioned themselves in carefully selected firing positions, waited for the Americans to approach, then opened fire simultaneously at a range of approximately 75 meters. All 3 Japanese tanks fired. All 3 rounds struck the lead Sherman. All 3 rounds ricocheted harmlessly off the thick frontal armor, leaving nothing but shallow dents. The Sherman's turret rotated with mechanical precision, the 75mm gun traversing to acquire the nearest target. Maeda's tank commander screamed for the driver to reverse, but before Maeda could engage the transmission, the Sherman fired. The high-explosive round struck the turret ring of the neighboring Hargo. The tank exploded with such violence that the turret was blown completely off the hull, cartwheeling through the air before crashing into the undergrowth 30 meters away. The Sherman fired again. The second Japanese tank, attempting to flee, took a 75mm round directly into the engine compartment. The diesel fuel ignited despite the engine's supposedly safer characteristics. The crew bailed out into American machine gun fire. 2 were killed immediately. The third man surrendered. Maeda's tank, the third Hargo, managed to reverse into heavy vegetation before the Sherman could acquire it. They abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot. Maeda survived the battle, the campaign, and eventually the war, though he spent nearly 4 years in American POW camps. He told his interrogators that after watching 2 tanks destroyed in seconds, he understood that Japanese armor doctrine was based on fantasy. The Type 95 couldn't fight American tanks, it could only die. This lesson was learned repeatedly across dozens of Pacific islands. At Saipan, the largest armored engagement in the Pacific War provided statistical validation of the disparity. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment began the battle with 44 tanks. American forces deployed hundreds. The mathematics predicted the outcome before the first shot was fired. The battle began at 0300 hours on June 17, 1944, when Japanese armor advanced toward the Marine beachhead. American forces had established defensive positions overnight, including tank platoons positioned hull down with excellent fields of fire. When Japanese tanks appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, Marine tankers opened fire at ranges exceeding 500 meters. The Japanese, relying on shock and speed, continued advancing despite mounting losses. Within 30 minutes, 20 Japanese tanks had been destroyed. The attack continued. Japanese infantry, advancing alongside the armor, suffered horrific casualties from American artillery and machine gun fire. More tanks burned. By 0400 hours, the attack had penetrated American lines in several places, but at catastrophic cost. 32 Japanese tanks had been destroyed. The remaining 12 withdrew in disorder. Dawn revealed the full extent of the carnage. Burned-out Type 95s littered the battlefield, some still smouldering, others torn apart by internal explosions. American engineers counted over 800 dead Japanese soldiers around the destroyed tanks. Not a single American tank had been lost to enemy armor. 3 Shermans had been damaged by artillery fire and subsequently repaired. The disparity wasn't just technical, it was operational and tactical. Individual accounts from this battle provided insight into the human dimension of the fighting. Corporal Robert Wilson, a Sherman gunner with the 4th Tank Battalion, described engaging Japanese armor that morning. His tank, positioned behind earthworks with only the turret exposed, spotted 3 Type 95s advancing in line formation across open ground. The range was approximately 600 meters. Wilson's commander ordered him to engage the rightmost tank first, then work left across the formation. Wilson laid the gun, waited for the proper lead angle to account for the tank's movement, and fired. The armor-piercing round struck the turret of the Type 95, penetrating cleanly and detonating inside. The tank stopped immediately, smoke pouring from every hatch. Wilson traversed left, acquired the second target, and fired again. Another hit, another kill. The 3rd Japanese tank, realizing it was under fire, attempted to reverse. Wilson's 3rd shot struck it in the side as it turned. All 3 Type 95s were destroyed in under 45 seconds. Wilson later wrote that he felt no satisfaction from this engagement. The Japanese crews never had a chance. They were sent into battle with inadequate equipment against overwhelming opposition. That they came at all demonstrated courage. That they died demonstrated the futility of fighting a modern war with obsolete tools. Similar patterns emerged at Tinian in July 1944, where 7 Type 95s were destroyed during Japanese counterattacks on July 24. At Guam, 10 Hagos were eliminated by bazookas and Sherman fire during fighting on July 21. At Peleliu in September, Japanese commanders had learned from previous defeats and employed their tanks primarily as static fortifications rather than mobile weapons. This extended their survival time but didn't change the ultimate outcome. American forces methodically reduced each position. The Battle of Peleliu deserves particular attention because it represented Japan's evolved armored doctrine. Rather than throwing tanks away in suicidal charges, Japanese defenders positioned Type 95s in prepared emplacements where they could support infantry from protected positions. The tanks were dug in with only their turrets exposed, surrounded by infantry strongpoints, and positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. This tactical adaptation made the tanks harder to destroy but no more effective. American forces identified each position through reconnaissance, then reduced them with concentrated artillery fire or direct assault by tanks and infantry. A Type 95 dug into a prepared position could withstand small arms fire and some indirect fire, but it remained vulnerable to tank guns, heavy artillery, and demolition charges. Once the position was identified, it was destroyed. The only question was how long it took. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, serving with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at Peleliu, described encountering a dug-in Japanese tank. His company had been pinned down by machine gun fire from a ridge when they realized the fire was coming from a Type 95 positioned in a concrete-reinforced cave. The turret was barely visible, making it extremely difficult to engage with direct fire. The Marines called for tank support. An M4 Sherman advanced to within 200 meters of the position, absorbing several 37mm hits that left superficial scars on its frontal armor. The Sherman's gunner methodically placed 75mm high-explosive rounds into the cave opening, collapsing the structure and burying the Japanese tank under tons of coral and concrete. the infantry advanced to secure the position. The Type 95's crew had died without ever leaving their tank, entombed in a position they knew would become their grave. The final chapter of the Type 95's combat history played out on Okinawa from April through June 1945. The 27th Tank Regiment represented the last significant Japanese armoured formation in the Tomes 4B Pacific. With 13 Type 95 light tanks and 14 Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha medium tanks, the regiment prepared to defend the southern portion of the island against the largest amphibious operation in Pacific War history. American forces landed over 180,000 troops on Okinawa, supported by more than 800 tanks from 8 Army tank battalions, 2 Marine tank battalions, and 2 Marine independent tank companies. The numerical disparity exceeded 30-1. The qualitative disparity remained absolute. Against hundreds of Shermans equipped with 75mm or 76mm guns, the Japanese light and medium tanks with their 37mm and 47mm weapons could accomplish nothing. On May 5, 1945, Japanese commanders launched their final armoured counterattack of the Pacific War. The 27th Tank Regiment, supported by infantry from the 62nd Division, attacked American positions in a desperate attempt to disrupt the ongoing offensive. The attack began after midnight, with Japanese tanks advancing under cover of darkness. American forces, alerted by outpost positions, illuminated the battlefield with artillery-fired star shells and engaged with overwhelming firepower. Within 2 hours, most of the Japanese armour lay destroyed. American tanks, firing from prepared positions with excellent visibility thanks to illumination rounds, methodically destroyed target after target. Anti-tank guns firing 37mm, 57mm, and 75mm rounds added to the carnage. Bazookas fired by infantry at close range knocked out tanks that penetrated American lines. By dawn, the 27th Tank Regiment effectively ceased to exist. A few damaged tanks limped back to Japanese lines. The rest burned across the battlefield. The human cost of these engagements extended beyond simple casualty numbers. Each destroyed Type 95 represented 3 dead crewmen, a commander, a driver, and a machine gunner. Multiply this by the hundreds of tanks destroyed across the Pacific campaign, and the toll becomes staggering. Thousands of Japanese tank crewmen died fighting in vehicles they knew were inadequate, following orders they knew were suicidal, in a war they increasingly understood was unwinnable. But the story of the Type 95 reveals more than just tactical failure. It exposes the fundamental industrial and strategic limitations that doomed Japan's war effort. The tank wasn't just obsolete because of poor design. It was obsolete because Japanese industry lacked the capacity to produce anything better in meaningful numbers, while simultaneously meeting the demands of naval aviation, surface fleet construction, aircraft production, and all the other requirements of modern warfare. The steel allocation problem alone reveals this reality. In 1944, Japan produced approximately 7 million metric tons of steel. Of this, the Imperial Japanese Navy received priority allocation for warship construction and repair. Shipyards consumed over 40% of available steel. Aircraft production required another 20%. Army requirements, including tank production, artillery manufacture, small arms, and fortification construction, competed for the remaining 40%. Within the Army's allocation, tank production ranked relatively low in priority. Japanese military leadership, influenced by their experience in China and Manchuria, viewed tanks primarily as infantry support weapons rather than decisive combat systems. They allocated resources accordingly. The result was that Japanese industry could produce perhaps 200 tanks per year at full capacity, and actual production fell well short of this theoretical maximum due to bombing, resource shortages, and competing priorities. Exceeded 89 million metric tons, more than 12 times Japanese output. American industry faced no comparable resource constraints. Steel was abundant. Electrical power was unlimited. Machine tools were available in massive quantities. The workforce, though stretched by military mobilization, remained productive and grew more efficient as war production accelerated. American industry could simultaneously build thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of warships, and maintain all of them in combat operations across multiple theaters. This industrial disparity manifested in every aspect of the weapons themselves. American tanks featured sophisticated gyroscopic gun stabilizers that allowed accurate fire while moving. Japanese tanks lacked this technology. American tanks included reliable radio equipment in every vehicle, enabling coordination and command and control. Japanese tanks often lacked radios, relying on flag signals and hand gestures for communication. American tanks used high-quality optical sights with precise ranging mechanisms. Japanese tanks made do with crude sighting systems that required extensive crew training to use effectively. The maintenance and logistics infrastructure reflected these same disparities. American armored units deployed with extensive repair facilities, spare parts inventories, and trained technicians who could repair or replace damaged components quickly. A Sherman that threw a track or suffered engine failure could typically be returned to service within 24 hours. Tanks that suffered more serious damage could be evacuated to rear area depots where specialized repair facilities performed major overhauls. The supply system ensured continuous availability of ammunition, fuel, lubricants, and replacement parts. Japanese armored units, by contrast, operated with minimal logistical support. Spare parts were scarce or non-existent. Specialized tools were unavailable. Trained mechanics were few. A Type 95 that suffered mechanical failure often remained deadlined indefinitely, cannibalized for parts to keep other tanks running. Ammunition resupply was sporadic. Fuel deliveries were uncertain. As the war progressed and American submarines throttled Japanese shipping, these logistics problems became catastrophic. By 1945, Japanese tank crews on Pacific Islands were often reduced to using their vehicles as stationary pillboxes, simply because they lacked the fuel to move them. Tanks that could have retreated to better defensive positions remained static because no diesel was available. Ammunition for the 37mm guns became so scarce that crews were ordered to fire only when certain of a hit. Some tanks fought their final battles with only a few dozen rounds remaining. The training disparity compounded these material disadvantages. American tank crews received extensive instruction at facilities like Fort Knox, where they spent months mastering gunnery, tactics, maintenance, and combined arms coordination. They practiced live fire exercises, learned radio procedures, and trained in realistic scenarios that prepared them for combat conditions. By the time American tankers reached the Pacific, they were skilled professionals operating familiar equipment. Japanese tank crews received far less training, and what training they did receive often used obsolete equipment in scenarios that bore little resemblance to actual Pacific combat. Training facilities in Manchuria and Japan taught tactics developed for fighting in China against poorly equipped opponents. The doctrine emphasized shock and mobility, rather than the defensive fighting that characterized Pacific Island warfare. Crews learned to operate their tanks but rarely practiced the kind of combined arms coordination that made American armor effective. The cultural differences between American and Japanese military organizations also influenced armor effectiveness. American armored doctrine encouraged initiative and adaptation. Tank commanders were expected to assess situations and make tactical decisions based on conditions they observed. Radio communication allowed rapid coordination between units and with supporting infantry. When tactics didn't work, they were modified. After-action reports identified problems and proposed solutions. The entire system was designed to learn and improve. Japanese military culture emphasized obedience and adherence to doctrine over adaptation and initiative. Tank commanders followed orders precisely, even when those orders proved suicidal. Deviation from established doctrine was discouraged. The rigid hierarchy limited tactical flexibility, and the reluctance to acknowledge failure meant that lessons learned in combat often failed to influence future operations. Japanese tank crews repeated the same mistakes across multiple campaigns because the institutional structure prevented learning from experience. These cultural factors manifested in tragic ways. At Saipan, Japanese tank commanders launched their attack in line formation across open ground because doctrine specified this formation, despite the fact that it exposed all vehicles to maximum fire. At Peleliu, tanks were ordered to defend static positions, even after it became clear that American firepower could reduce any fixed fortification. At Okinawa, the final counterattack followed a plan developed weeks earlier, despite changing conditions that made the attack futile. Japanese tank crews died because their leadership valued adherence to doctrine over adaptation to reality. The post-war analysis of Pacific armored warfare produced several important conclusions that influenced military thinking for decades. First, the importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare cannot be overstated. Japan lost the tank war before the first shot was fired because Japanese industry could never match American production. Second, tactical skill and courage cannot overcome fundamental material disadvantage. Japanese tank crews fought bravely with inadequate equipment and died in large numbers without significantly affecting battle outcomes. Third, adaptable doctrine and good training matter as much as good equipment. American success resulted from the combination of superior vehicles, superior doctrine, and superior training. The legacy of the Type 95 extends beyond the Pacific War. After Japan's surrender, hundreds of Hargo tanks remained in China, where they were used by both nationalist and communist forces during the Chinese Civil War. The People's Liberation Army operated captured Type 95s during the Korean War, where they again encountered and were destroyed by American M4 Shermans. Even in 1950, the Type 95 remained hopelessly obsolete. Today, approximately 15 Type 95 tanks survive in museums around the world. The National Museum of the Pacific War, in Fredericksburg, Texas, displays a replica. The Australian War Memorial preserves an original recovered from the Pacific. The U.S. Army Museum of Hawaii exhibits one captured on Okinawa. These preserved vehicles serve as physical reminders of the technological and industrial disparities that shaped the Pacific War. For the Marines who fought in the Pacific, the Type 95 became a symbol of Japanese desperation and the futility of fighting modern warfare with obsolete equipment. Veterans' accounts consistently express respect for the courage of Japanese tank crews who went into battle knowing they faced overwhelming odds. But they also emphasize the tragedy of men sent to fight with inadequate tools in an unwinnable war. The mathematics tell the story with brutal clarity. 12 millimeters of armor against 75 millimeter guns, 8 tons against 30 tons, 120 horsepower against 400 horsepower, 2,300 produced against 63,000 produced. These numbers explain why Japanese tank crews called their vehicles coffins on tracks. They explain why American tankers described encounters with Type 95s as target practice rather than combat. They explain why the largest tank battle in Pacific history lasted less than 2 hours. The Type 95 Hargo wasn't the worst tank design of World War II. For its intended purpose, fighting in China in the late 1930s, it was adequate. The problem was that Japan continued using it long after it became obsolete, not because Japanese planners were incompetent, but because Japanese industry couldn't produce anything better in sufficient numbers. The tank became a symbol of Japan's strategic predicament, fighting a war against an opponent with 10 times the industrial capacity, using equipment designed for a different era, following a doctrine that couldn't adapt to changing realities. When Corporal Henderson watched Japanese tanks burn, on Saipan that morning in June 1944, he was witnessing the intersection of industrial policy, strategic planning, tactical doctrine, and human courage. The Type 95 crews who died in that attack were brave men fighting for their country with the tools they were given. That their tools were inadequate wasn't their fault. That they fought anyway, despite knowing the odds, was testament to their courage. That they died in large numbers without affecting the battle's outcome was testament to the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. The Pacific War's armored battles don't receive the same historical attention as the tank battles in Europe. There was no Pacific equivalent of Kursk or the Battle of the Bulge, no massive armor clashes with hundreds of tanks engaged simultaneously. But the smaller-scale engagements in the Pacific revealed the same fundamental truths about modern warfare. Industrial capacity matters, technology matters, training matters, doctrine, matters. And courage alone, however admirable, cannot overcome the combination of material disadvantage and strategic incompetence. The final tally speaks for itself. American tank forces in the Pacific suffered minimal losses to Japanese armor. The few American tanks destroyed by Japanese tanks resulted from tactical surprise or ambush rather than fair fights. In head-to-head engagements, American armor won consistently and decisively. The Type 95 Hago entered the Pacific War obsolete and became more obsolete with each passing year. By 1945, it was less a combat vehicle than a mobile coffin, a rolling monument to the futility of Japan's war effort. For the thousands of Japanese tank crewmen who died fighting in these vehicles, the Type 95 represents a tragic waste of courage and dedication. They deserved better equipment, better doctrine, and better strategic leadership. They received none of these things. Instead, they received thin armor that couldn't protect them, weak guns that couldn't harm enemy tanks, and orders that sent them to certain death. That they followed those orders says much about their courage. That they died in such numbers says much about the war their leaders chose to fight. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.